Chapter 17 Under the Eaves. Madame Coldwater's house party appeared to have dissolved. The luncheon that Cristel and Selina had suspected might be a big affair of perhaps a dozen or more people consisted simply of themselves, Alexander Coldwater, and his grandmother, and Alexander was punctual. Indeed, he was waiting for them under the portico, and he did not conceal his keen pleasure in their coming. He had seen Selina only once before, that day when he had gone to Tinkle Bell, but the artist in him had remembered her with satisfaction and delight, and of course he was devoted to Cristel. He had let his grandmother know this from the very first. Devotion with Alexander, his grandmother well knew, meant devotion, and not at all the thing that the word used now so easily as common coin conveys. It had been a blow to her. Why couldn't he have picked someone else, anyone else, for his devotion? Then she had risen to it. He had not understood her intensity at all when she looked at him with a very odd expression in her eyes and murmured, "It must be fate." He insisted that the girls remove their hats. "It's not a formal party," he protested. "Your hats make it formal." Since showing Cristel her flower garden, grandmother can never be formal with a Barker again. Isn't that true, grandmother? Don't we four belong to each other now? Madame Coldwater laughed. "You are incorrigible," she remarked to her grandson. "They shall do just as they please about their hats, but whether we four belong to each other, that remains with Selina to decide, I think. Fate can be incorrigible as well as temperamental grandsons." Fate again. Cristel and Alexander looked vague, but Selina understood. It seemed to her, too, that fate was to be present today, a third guest at the table. In spite of Alexander's assurances that nothing was to be formal, the luncheon seemed very formal to the girls. 2 manservants served it, and a third stood near the swinging pantry door, inaudibly directing operations. There were many courses, and there was wine, and it was all very hushed and dignified. Alexander himself appeared subdued after his first attempts. He sat rather silent, and whenever Cristel looked his way, he was looking at her. She could not fathom his look. It was kind and full of friendliness, as Dr. Grant's was always kind and full of friendliness, but it was more, and though there was no chair set for fate, and no wine-glass placed, his wings were folded there. He was present. No wonder there was a hush. No wonder Alexander's smoky blue eyes were more ambiguous than usual and expectant. The meal was so long that Cristel began to wonder whether they would be finished with it in time for her to get to her rehearsal. But she did not look at her wrist watch. She felt that one shouldn't do that while at the table with one's hostess. But directly the leaf-shaped silver finger bowls had done their service, and the party were ready to withdraw to Madame Coldwater's favorite drawing room for conversation and coffee. Cristel forgot about the time, for now Madame Coldwater seemed prepared to explain for Alexander's and Cristel's enlightenment her allusion to fate. Selina needed no explanations. Her hand, as it accidentally brushed Cristel's, was cold, but she was, to the eye, as poised and serene as ever as they went from the dining room. The sisters stopped short just inside the drawing-room door and exclaimed soft ohs of surprise, for at the far end of the apartment, the only picture on the gray wall, hung Alexander's portrait of Cristel and Hebe. It was framed in a wide platinum-like frame, and hung so that it got the best possible light. Here, in this setting, and in its frame, it was a richer, more striking picture than it had seemed on the view. The Cristel of the picture was looking directly across the room toward them, her gaze a little above the level of their heads. She was sitting with her feet drawn back under her skirts, Prince's Pine and Pearly Everlasting about her knees. Her hair was blowing ever so softly, one thick, wavy lock, dense and without any highlights, half concealing a cheek. Her eyes looked directly into the distance, far, far beyond the room, far, far to a view of mountains, one could swear. They were clear and unthoughtful, accepting the view in all simplicity. The clarity of the eyes and face had decided Alexander to name his picture Cristel, not the fact that that was actually her name. In the background, in shadow, Hebe sat, her body a little obscured by Cristel's shoulder and skirts, her head turned away, just a hint of her cheek visible, and the bend of her neck. Her hair caught the light in outline, and seemed delicately aureoled, more with silver than with gold. However, she was looking down at the flowers and grass. On her knees, the crown circled by her long, tapering fingers, lay her wide, silvery hat. Critics in the future were bound to praise the painting of that hat. It seemed in some mysterious way to belong to the grass and the flowers, as well as to Hebe's head, aureoled with silver. Madame Coldwater stood now, as tranced as the girls, looking at the painting. It had been hung only this morning, and in spite of having spent most of the hours since its hanging with it here in the drawing-room, she was still moved by it, still plainly glowing with happiness in it. "There it is," she said, turning to Selina finally. "With happenings like this, what is one to do? To think that it is Alexander's." They sat on a big divan in the center of the room, facing the canvas. Alexander paced up and down at their backs, his nervous steps muffled by the rugs. But when he heard his grandmother command Selina, "Now tell me, if you will, what argument that strange Hebe so fortunately used to persuade you that Alexander must be let go on with the picture," he came over to them, and leaned on the divan's back, listening intently. Selina replied, "There was just one argument. Hebe said that if Alexander went on with the picture, it might very likely be the turning point in his career. He had seen a vision, she thought, and seen it clearly. He must not lose his chance to put it in paint, just because any pride of yours or mine or even mother's. We had no right to interfere with art." She said all that. Madame Coldwater looked back over her shoulder at Alexander. What a remarkable person she is, that Hebe, and how right. Alexander was more than uneasy at this turn of the conversation. He laughed rather forcedly and said, "Yes, isn't she? But tell us, Selina, all you think about the picture itself. I want to hear all, every single word everyone utters about that. Egotism, of course, but just the same." Madame Coldwater would not let him run away with the conversation so easily, however. She pulled it back into her own hands. "I can't reconcile Heve's position at the Red House with all that I keep hearing about her," she insisted. "She sounds not only a cultivated, educated person, but a person of unique wisdom too. She has taken on the proportions of the mythical in my mind." So they had to talk about Hebe, much as Alexander disliked it. Crystal was comforted and delighted with all that Madame Coldwater and Selina agreed on about her friend. She could not understand Alexander's brusqueness when he protested. "Oh, everyone's educated these days, clerks and cooks, and everyone. There's nothing extraordinary in Hebe's being educated too. Why make a mystery of it? Why can't you be like Crystal and me and just accept her for what she is, a darned nice person?" Madame Coldwater was turned quite about on the divan, looking at her grandson speculatively. "Do you want me to accept her, Alexander?" she asked. "Shall we invite her to dinner?" He threw up his hands. "Heaven forbid!" he exclaimed, and returned to his pacings. Crystal stood up and looked at him. What did he mean? Why had he said, "Heaven forbid," in that irate tone at the suggestion Madame Coldwater had made of inviting Hebe to dinner? Why he was behaving the way Miss Grant behaved. Her throat was dry, and she had the sensations she had suffered in the Grants' dining room weeks ago, when Miss Grant had spoken of Hebe with such unfriendliness. But it did not spread and grow, that feeling. She met Alexander's eyes. They were certainly troubled, but for her they held friendly understanding, even if she couldn't understand. She ended by smiling at him, howbeit wanly, and sitting down. But she sat down only to rise again. Madame Coldwater said, "Come with me, all three of you. I have another picture to show you." They went out and up a wide, shallow staircase to the second floor. That floor they traversed for nearly its whole distance, a considerable walk, and then ascended to the third. The few people they encountered on this promenade were servants, all of whom looked at them with the same expression of indifferently controlled surprise at their being in these regions. At the end of the longest and widest passage, Alexander opened for his grandmother a narrow white door, and they passed into an enormous white room, lined with cupboards and shelves and drawers. This was Blue Diamond's linen room, and it smelled of lavender and rose. A woman in gray, white-capped and aproned, and with graying hair, sat in a comfortable big chair near one of the windows, marking a sheet. Another younger woman in the same gray and the same type of cap and apron was counting and sorting towels at a white table. Madame Coldwater, the young people following, passed through this room toward the opposite door, nodding to the servants and ignoring their evident surprise, a surprise that amounted almost to consternation at seeing her there. The room they entered now was the trunk room, but Crystal thought it a fascinating and a lovely room for all that. Suitcases were ranged on shelves, and trunks lined the walls under the shelves. There were leather hat boxes, golf bags, wicker baskets, chests, and numberless painted wicker containers. It was a long, narrow room with high windows, their sills above Crystal's head, through which she could only see the tips of trees, blowing now in a windy rain. The floor was rugless and painted a golden yellow. Over everything was the clean, refreshing smell of cedar, and from an open window the smell of wet green boughs. Why Crystal liked the room so much she could not have told. Perhaps it was its isolation out here in the tree tops, and the smell of cedar. It certainly was not because of the picture, for she had given her allegiance to the room before she discovered that. But Selina saw the picture at once, and Alexander saw it too. Alexander spoke first. "Oh, now I know," he exclaimed in startled tones. "Now I know why Selina seemed like a ghost to me in the arbor that day. It was the ghost of a memory. I had seen her picture." By now they were, the three of them, standing together before a picture hung in a gilded frame between two clusters of shelves with their burdens of suitcases. It was amazing to find a picture here at all, but a picture of Selina. "Only how can it be you, Selina?" Alexander spoke again, since no one else seemed desirous of speaking. "I was just a little fellow when I discovered it. I remember now, years and years and years ago, on that visit here with you, grandmother. You were about the same age then, yourself, Selina. Must have been. Then how?" But by now Crystal had realized that it was not a picture of her sister at all. It was a painting of their mother that hung there in the obscurity of Blue Diamond's trunk room. Chapter 18. The Accident. Those were not Selina's serene eyes looking down at them, and it was not Selina's tranquil brow, though everything else was Selina. Crystal had never seen a painting of her mother, but in all the photographs the girls cherished, She did look very like Selina, of course. She was as great a beauty. The difference was, and the artist had discovered it, she was not so happy. There was a storminess in her eyes. Even her honey-colored hair was piled stormily on her head, masses of it, heaped like overlapping clouds. The smile on the bright lips could not hide the restlessness of the spirit. Only Alexander cared to speak. He had figured it out for himself by now that this must be a portrait of Selina's mother. He too had caught the differences. He said, puzzled, "It is the mother of Selina. It must be. Who was she, grandmother? And how did father come to paint her?" This is, in his early manner, but very fine. Heavens, if I ever do anything one half so good. And why, in heaven's name, is it hung off up here? I remember perfectly now, years and years ago, finding it and staying with it a long time. At least it seemed long to me. And the cedar chest smelled just the same, and the linen room when I came through. Only all the windows were opened in both these rooms, and the place was washed in sunlight. No wonder I thought you were a ghost out of memory, Selina, when I saw you for the first time in your arbor that morning. Although Selina knew the story that Madame Coldwater was now prepared to tell Crystal and Alexander, she had known nothing of this painting. She was all the more moved by it. And when Madame Coldwater told them to find seats, Selina herself sat down on a little black trunk facing the picture. Crystal chose the floor, and Alexander followed her there, his shoulder close to hers. Madame Coldwater took the one chair in the room. She began her story at once and told it in a concise way, but for all that she did not hide completely her pain from the young eyes watching her. Your mother, Ellen Derby, was the greatest and closest friend I ever had, Selina and Crystal. Yes, in spite of the difference in our ages. Our friendship began when she was a little girl of 8, and I took a motherly interest in the beautiful little girl because she was motherless and so badly governed, but even more because she captivated my affection from the minute I saw her. Her father was the proverbial professor, wrapped up in his books and researches. I don't think he ever even knew that his daughter was beautiful. It was very simple to get his consent to an oversight of the child. He allowed me to select her governesses, to decide on her diet, and choose her frocks. Within a year from the time I first noticed her, it was practically as though she was my own little girl. I had only sons, and she filled need. But more than that, I was drawn to her, and she was drawn to me, I know, by a deep affinity of friendship. While my children were young, I did not travel as I have since, and most of the winters I spent in my Boston house. Ellen Derby came to play in my nursery and had her lessons with the boys until they went away to school. Maurice, my oldest son, adored her from the beginning. It was when he was 10 and she was 8 that he decided to marry her, and he never changed his mind. She quarreled with the others, and they with her, in a perfectly normal fashion, but with Maurice she never quarreled. They seemed of one mind from the first hour of their meeting in Ellen's nursery, where they played authors and old maid, and took turns riding on Ellen's big yellow lion. By the time Ellen was 15, she was my closest friend. I can honestly say this. I gave her the affection that one has only for rare and special friends, and that was over and above my maternal feeling for her. She was, without exception, the most companionable soul I have ever known. It was delightful to do things with her, whether it was travel, the theater, or merely an afternoon of knitting. Her charm was a charm there can be no words for. I gave her her coming-out party the winter she was 18, and I chaperoned her all that season. I think it was one of the happiest winters of my life. That happier than my own first season. I was so proud of her, and she had such a good time. But all the while I knew that she would marry Maurice. It seems absurd, but without words, the boys and I and Ellen herself had known this for years. We went abroad that summer after her coming out, all of us together. We bought an automobile and toured France. Everything between Maurice and Ellen was taken so for granted that I cannot remember their announcing their engagement to me, or even any discussion about the date for the wedding. But there must have been some discussion, for the date was fixed for the month of our return to Boston. It was during that month, while the final preparations were being made, that Maurice painted this portrait. 1 week before the appointed wedding day, your mother met your father, and 1 day before the wedding day, she married him. That is the story. I suppose the love between herself and Maurice had been too simple, too full, too overflowing with the sunlight of sisterly and brotherly affection to hold her against the other, newer and strange attraction. I can begin to see it now, after all these years. Then I saw nothing. I had given her Tinkle Bell for a wedding present, a little place to play with, much as I had given her doll-houses when she was little. She sent back all our other presents, the jewels, and the things we had collected together abroad, but I would not let her give back your Tinkle Bell. I felt that one day she might need it practically. I determined never to open Blue Diamond when she was occupying Tinkle Bell, but she never did occupy it, as you know, and I never saw her again. After you girls came to live here, I felt I had to stay away till this summer, but this summer it drew me back. I intended, however, to see nothing of you, but whenever I went beyond my gates, I seemed fated to see you, and there was Selina, in church every Sunday, looking exactly like my Ellen. Then Alexander painted Crystal, and developed instantaneously, with his first sight of her on the view, the devotion that all my boys had had for Ellen. Do you wonder that I mentioned Fate Alexander? Selina's profile in church was Ellen's profile, that had so often delighted my heart across the nave of St. John's when she went there with her father, and the old feeling took possession of me, as fresh as though it had never died. You are so motherless. I ought to be your mother, your grandmother, I suppose rather, but it's closer than that. It is maternal, not grand-maternal. I want you to spend next winter with me in my Boston house, Selina. I want to give you a coming-out party, and afterwards chaperone you. And Crystal must give up this acting craze and go to Miss Putnam's with Agnes and Esther Grant. This is what I want for you girls next. Are you going to help me to bring it about? I think your mother wants it too. And Crystal, will you please tuck in that lock of hair? It is very untidy. There were no tears, no sentimental trembling of voices, no exclamations. Just practical discussion followed. Selina said that Miss Putnam's school would be out of the question for Crystal. Their income, all of it together, would not pay the tuition. Madame Coldwater had respect for Selina's independence, and did not say offhand that of course she would attend to that herself. Instead, she suggested that a piece or two of Professor Derby's old furniture could easily be sold. Antiques of the sort Tingle Bell harbored would bring large prices. It would be worth it. Miss Putnam's school was exactly what Crystal needed at this stage in her career. And as for Selina herself, well, that winter in Boston was her due. At any rate, Madame Coldwater wanted it for her very, very sincerely. You know, I would never have brought Crystal to Fairfleet at all, Selina said, if it could have been helped, if there was anything else for us to do. Mother had told me all this, and told me not to come unless it was a last resort. She wanted to save you from remembering. I was very young, but she told me about it all, and said all my life I must avoid you so that you would not remember and be hurt all over again. Now, how can I think she wants me to accept this invitation? You will remember all the time, all day, if I am with you. No, you don't understand. It is a new spring, everything green again. That doesn't make us remember the old spring with regret. It is only winter that makes us remember past springs. That is what is happening to me now, even if it is August. Madame Coldwater smiled. I am really living in a new spring. You and Crystal brought it, but I really owe it even more to that mythical Hebe. Without her, Alexander would never have finished the picture and become such great friends with Crystal. Selina and Crystal exchanged glances. They were thinking of the new season. Well, Hebe had brought a new season to Madame Coldwater, as well as to themselves, it seemed. Madame Coldwater might call it spring if she liked. I don't expect you, Selina, to say yes to everything right now, Madame Coldwater assured her, rising. There is the play absorbing you both, and Alexander too. The next 2 days are full ones, but keep it in your minds, my plan for this winter, and then we will talk it all over, calmly and reasonably. Let us go back to the drawing-room now." In the drawing-room they found Miss Grant, who had come to call, staring in amazement at the portrait of Cristel and Hebe. She turned on their entrance, her amazement still vivid in her face. When she saw Selina and Cristel there in the room, the amazement could not grow. It was already beyond enlargement. "I don't need to introduce you," Madame Coldwater said of the girls. "What do you think, my dear, of Alexander's new picture?" Miss Grant thought very highly of it. She knew something about pictures, too, a great deal in fact. The opinions she offered were intelligent and technical and just. But then she burst out, with her real interest, "Why ever did you put that dreadful woman in, Alexander? But have you heard what has happened? Paul has had an accident, broken his arm, and fractured an ankle. He was on his way to the post office after lunch, and Mr. Atwater's car, driven by his daughter, that scatterbrained Isabel, skidded and slammed into Paul walking at the side of the road. She should have taken him to our house, of course. It happened just outside, but instead she rushed him up to the Red House, causing him quite dreadful and needless suffering. Fortunately, I was there, working on costumes. We got the doctor at once. Madame Coldwater and Selina and Alexander were much concerned, but Cristel shocked them all a little by crying out, 'But the play? What will become of the play? Why, it's only 2 days off.' Miss Grant stared at her. 'Think about Paul,' she said quickly. 'The poor boy.' But Cristel was beyond thinking about Paul. What was a broken arm and a fractured ankle compared to the smash-up of the plans for the play? She became conscious that Miss Grant had not finished her tale. 'Yes, it was very fortunate. I was there,' she was saying. 'But even so, I was handicapped in all I tried to do by that woman Hebe. Why did you ever stick her into your picture, Alexander? She poisons it for me.' She rushed on, however, not allowing Alexander a chance to reply. 'She is never around where she is needed. She hasn't lifted a hand to help with the costumes. But she had to be in evidence then, of course, when she wasn't needed and nobody wanted her. She actually insisted on being in the room while the bone was being set. Paul couldn't be given ether because of a weak heart. We wouldn't have taken Hebe's word for that, but Paul himself said so, and Hilda and Bianca verified it. Hebe took a disgusting morbid interest. She stuck by when the doctor sent even me away. Paul was simply wonderful, the doctor says, but he says Hebe was like a graven image as far as showing any feeling went. He made her help him, since she was there. I'm glad he got something out of her, even if the rest of us haven't been able to. But of course, it should have been either Bianca or I who stayed. I don't know, though, that I could have borne it. Such suffering for the poor boy. He was game, so brave. When it was all over, he laughed, and she said the only words she had said the whole time, except earlier, when she was giving orders to everyone in the place before the doctor actually began to work. She laughed and said, "Bless you," to Paul. Can you imagine the coolness of that? Even the doctor thought it was a little too cool. This recital had taken Crystal's mind for the while from her bitter disappointment about the play. She was really concerned for Paul at last. Poor fellow, poor comrade. "I am going up and see how he is," she declared, and Alexander quickly said, "I will take you. There isn't anything we could do, Miss Grant, is there? Send a telegram to his mother or anything. Has she been wired to?" Hilda wanted to attend to all that. "I think it would be very well for you to go up, though, and see if there's anything. And will you take this letter? It is a note I wrote to Victoria Gildersleeve while the doctor was working on Paul. I thought she would like to get my version of the thing. When the doctor came out, I got definite details from him to put in a postscript. Of course Victoria Gildersleeve will want them. She's a strange mother if she doesn't come to Fairfleet now. I took the opportunity to inform her a little about Hebe's behavior and things I am sure the children haven't stressed." She gave the letter to Crystal. It was stamped, but not addressed. "I forgot to get the address from Hilda," she explained. "Give the letter to her, please, and ask her to address it and put it out on the mailbox for the maids to take down to the post office tonight. That will save time." As Crystal left the room with Alexander, she heard Miss Grant saying to Selina in calmer tones that she had yet used, "It's a nice surprise to find you here. How long have you all been acquainted? I suppose the picture brought you together. It is truly magnificent." As they spun along over the slippery road, the rain sprang their faces, for although Alexander had the top of his roadster up, the windshield was open. Crystal remembered Miss Grant's words. She's a strange mother if she doesn't come to Fairfleet now, to the exclusion of those other words that so concerned Hebe. I took the opportunity to inform her a little about Hebe's behavior and things I'm sure the children haven't stressed. If Victoria Gildersleeve should really come, if Crystal should once see her plain, that would make up, perhaps, for the ruin of the play and all Crystal's dreams and hopes for it. Yes, in her veneration for the great actress, Crystal came to the conclusion that everything would be made up for by her presence in Fairfleet, if only for one day. In this reconciling thought, she did not remember that the letter on her knee bore criticism to Victoria Gildersleeve of her dear Hebe, or if the memory did brush her mind, it was let fly on by Crystal's conviction that Victoria Gildersleeve would be so great a person herself that she would be sure to recognize the wonderfulness of Hebe. Chapter 19. Hebe hides. Hilda said that only one of them might go up to see Paul. Of course, they decided it should be Crystal. She found him in bed, propped up on pillows, his arm in a black sling, and his wounded ankle resting on cushions. Hebe, sitting close by his side, had been reading to him, but before Crystal came in, the reading had stopped, and they were both watching the door for her. Paul's face was just exactly the color of his pillows. This shocked Crystal, and stripped from her the last clinging shreds of her own selfish speculations. "Oh, Paul, I am so sorry," she said softly in a hushed, sick-room tone, but Paul's voice, responding, had its usual quality. "Yes, isn't it sickening?" he blurted. "And oh, I say, Barker, I'm glad you've come. You can help us decide who's to do Romeo." He motioned to a chair near her own. "Paul wants to go on with everything," she explained, "and there's no reason why he shouldn't. Only a Romeo's got to be found." "What is that? A letter?" "Yes. Miss Grant wants Hilda to address it to her mother. I forgot to give it to her downstairs. How can we get another Romeo in just one day?" "I don't see what you mean." The letter slipped from Crystal's lap to the floor, where it lay forgotten here as it had been downstairs. After a little while, Hebe picked it up and held it in her hand, idly, unconscious of what she was doing, while the three talked. The next day, Crystal was to remember the letter in Hebe's hand. At the time, it interested her less than anything in the world, and did not hold her conscious attention for an instant. Of course Crystal was careless and heedless. Of course the letter was a responsibility. There is no excuse for her, but she was soon to pay for it, all in keen suffering, and so, perhaps, justice was done ultimately. Paul thinks we might switch one of the boys from the part he has over to Romeo. If any one of them knew the lines. If there'd only been an understudy. Do you think anyone does know any of the part at all?" They were both looking at Crystal for inspiration. She bowed her head on her knees, a childish attitude she often took when she was tired or thinking. Now she was both. The last days had been the most strenuous ones of her life, and the most exciting. When she sat up, she had her answer, though. "No, I'm sure there's no one, except Mercutio, possibly, but he can't be spared. There's no other way. Esther'll have to play the nurse, and I take Romeo. I know every single word and all the cues. I know the whole play, in fact." Strange as it may seem, it was with no joy Crystal had seen this solution for the problem. She had grown a lot and learned a lot in artistic wisdom during the past weeks, and she knew that the old nurse, as she was doing it, stood some chance of getting Mr. Gildersleeve's attention and approbation. She had worked on it until it was very nearly gem-like in its perfection. Her acting of Romeo would be another matter. She had not thought herself into that part, except so far as she had thought herself into the play in its entirety, and of course she had not had the advantage of Paul's coaching in inflection and stage business for it. No, so far as her own ambitions went, and her hopes, this would be a very stupid move for her, but she made it. I shall have to do it, she said clearly. They were saying nothing, only looking at her. After some reflection, while he gazed at her keenly, Paul shook his head. There's nothing more hateful than a girl in a man's part, he exclaimed. Nothing, and you're more feminine than all the rest of the girls put together, Barker. Now, if it could be Hilda, but she's impossible. Hebe was not so decided. If Crystal knows the lines and the cues, you'd better think about it, Paul, if you want to do the play for your father. Why, look at her. Look at yourself in the glass over there, Crystal. You're so girlish. Crystal stood up and inspected herself in the mirror above Paul's chiffonier. It's my hair that makes me so girlish, she answered, in Romeo's clothes and in a wig. A wig? Bah! I don't think that will help a bit. But put it on, try it. Romeo's wig was lying right there at her hand on the top of the chiffonier, where Paul had tossed it this morning after rehearsal. She knew at a glance that she never could get it on over the masses of her hair, no matter how much she pulled her locks together and screwed them up. I'll simply have to cut my hair, she proclaimed. It can be cut with a better effect than that wig ever had. Can you think of anyone else, Paul? I'd rather do the nurse, much rather. You don't think Alexander Coldwater could learn the lines so soon, do you? Paul was as emphatic in his negation of that as he had been about Crystal's taking the part. I wouldn't have him if he could, he said. He's so much bigger and taller than any of the other fellows. He'd be out of the picture, spoil it altogether. Well, shall I cut my hair then? I'll do it right now, if you say so. Crystal was looking at a pair of shears on a table near. I've listened at rehearsals, Paul. I think I can fall in and do it a lot the way you've been doing it. She turned to Hebe. You cut my hair, she said. We can see how it looks anyway. She felt that from the very first, Hebe had been with her against Paul. She did not stop to wonder at Hebe's sudden interest in the production. She accepted it now that it had become visible as a matter of course. Do you really mean it? Hebe asked. And wouldn't Selina mind? No, Selina will be glad. She's always scolding about its untidiness and saying it ought to be cut. It's only that I mind. I think an actress should have long hair and not have to wear wigs, don't you? But it will grow again. She paused, thinking, and then finished her thinking out loud, standing shears in hand. There's no chance Mr. Gildersleeve will think I'm so wonderful as Romeo. He'll invite me right into his company anyway. It'll be a long time before I get another chance, and by then My old hair will have time to grow to the floor, most likely." Paul and Hebe understood her. Both realized that in taking over the part of Romeo, she was definitely giving up a real, no matter how foolish hope, for the sake of the play. This was abnegation, the seed Hebe herself had planted, now flowering. There was a flowering in Hebe's face, too, as she looked at Crystal making her sacrifice, but Crystal did not see it. She was unaware herself of the full meaning of the moment. Hebe took the shears and cut her hair. Paul, from his pillows, watched the operation doubtfully. He still persisted in his opinion that Barker was extreme in her femininity. When it was all done, however, and she stood, turning for inspection, he had to admit that she was changed unbelievably. Her hair curled now in thick clusters in her neck and hung in a thick, dense bang on her forehead. Her head, of course, had a new outline, firmer, clearer. "You can't possibly wear my costume," he said suddenly. "You're littler, and so slim." She looked littler, and slimmer indeed, than he had noticed, shorn of her blowing hair, and with her eyes grown peculiarly large and dark. "No, it will have to be an entirely new costume. Run away, Crystal, and call up Miss Grant about that. Selina will probably help, won't she? And Paul, now you must rest. Tomorrow you will be able to be carried out to dress rehearsal, if you're only careful now. Hilda's already planning a chair that will make you comfortable. You and Miss Grant, Crystal, work out Romeo's costume between you, and you'll probably have to coach Esther yourself in the nurse. Paul positively must be quiet now, and the day's not lost by any means. Mr. Gildersleeve is going to be surprised and impressed tomorrow night, and so is everyone." In this new Hebe, giving orders and cheer, Crystal felt a great source of strength. It was with a light heart she went toward the door, but she stopped on the threshold to ask, "Is Miss Gildersleeve coming? Has she wired?" "No, she's not coming," Paul replied. "I'm not at death's door or anything like that, you see. She is not coming." Why the accent on the coming? Hebe said nothing. She had taken her seat at Paul's head again, and was opening the book. She had used Miss Grant's letter to Victoria Gildersleeve for a bookmark when she got up to cut Crystal's hair. Now she placed it in the back of the book, but Crystal did not notice. Downstairs, Alexander was waiting for her. He was sitting on the hall bench, watching the stair landing for Crystal to reappear. She had been gone an unconscionably long time, he thought, yet he had been content to stay there waiting. But when he realized what had been done to her hair, he jumped up with an angry exclamation. "Crystal Barker! Crystal!" he cried. "What in heaven's name?" Crystal found it difficult to believe that all his excitement was about her hair. Why should he care like that? She put up her hand, stroking the back of her head, smiling. her eyes asking that question of him, and when she had explained the reason for the shearing, he seemed a little reconciled. "Well, I have my picture of you as you really are," he muttered. "I can look at that. As I really am." They both saw the humor of that, and Alexander had to smile. "But you might be any little shop girl now," he said. "They've all got hair like that, just a little shorter. Why, in New York and London and Paris, they're all the same, bobbed and boyish. You ought to be different, forever different." "I'm sorry," Crystal said. "I don't like to displease you. I want you to like me." She spoke gravely, sensitively. He smiled again. "I still like you," he said, "but it's a pity just the same." The next morning, before 11 o'clock, the new costume for Romeo was completed. Crystal paraded the room in it, and Miss Grant, with the rest of the costume committee, viewed it from every angle. "I think it will do," Miss Grant at last decided. "The cape seems a little long, but that doesn't matter much. It's a gorgeous color, isn't it? Come, Crystal, let's go see what Paul says about it." Paul had developed a temperature, and Dr. Grant had decreed that he must spend the entire day in bed if he hoped to be up tomorrow night for the performance. Dress rehearsal was to be gone through without him today. Miss Grant was going to coach, and really Paul's work had all been done before the accident. But they had promised to bring Romeo to him as soon as the fellow was completed. Hebe was with Paul when they entered, still reading out of that same book. Both were so absorbed in the story that they did not become aware of the visitors until they were across the threshold. From the expression on Hebe's face as she looked up, Crystal imagined that if she had been warned of their approach, they would not have discovered her here now. She stood, poised for quiet flight, but Miss Grant detained her. "Don't go," she said, "if Paul enjoys your reading. I'm glad you're willing to be of use. We simply want him to pass on this costume." Crystal looked at Hebe, meeting her eyes. Crystal's eyes said, "Please stay. I want you to pass on this costume." Paul himself turned to Hebe. "How is it? Do you like the color of the cape? It was gorgeous on me, but somehow it looks different on Barker." Hebe surveyed Romeo now, meditatively. "They've done a lot of work, Paul," she said. "It fits beautifully. But the color of the cape, and it seems too heavy for her shoulders. Don't you think so?" Now they were all looking at Hebe, Miss Grant, Paul, Crystal, and Hilda, who had drifted in. She looked as though she hated being called on for an opinion. "Yes, it is too heavy for Crystal's lightness," she agreed, "and the color is a trifle garish. Everything else is perfect, though." "I agree with you." Miss Grant spoke quickly. "You are quite right about its being too heavy. A whole width should be taken out of the cape, and it needs shortening. But there's not time now. I have more than I can do for the rest of the day, and everyone else is overworked and can't take on more. You'll have to come to the sewing room yourself, Hebe. I can start you so that you can't go wrong with it. Hebe shook her head. I'm sorry, but I'm not clever that way. I couldn't do it. Miss Grant shrugged. Then I'm afraid it will have to go, she said. It isn't very bad, I suppose, and since you won't help. But she never finished that sentence. Her eyes by chance had lighted on some torn pages of her own script among the logs of the fireplace by which she was standing. She bent sharply down to look. Then she picked up a piece of the paper. She studied it, a strange expression on her face. But when she turned toward Hebe, Hebe was gone. She had vanished, while Miss Grant was scrutinizing the bit of paper. Where is she? Where is that woman? Miss Grant's voice was hoarse, with righteous indignation. No one knew. No one had realized, until Miss Grant herself realized it, that Hebe had slipped from the room. She was here, standing by Paul's bed, and then suddenly she was gone, like light, Crystal thought. But Miss Grant's thought did not match Crystal's. She turned on her now. Did you give my letter to Hilda to post? She asked sharply. Then to Hilda. Did you post my letter, Hilda? Hilda, of course, did not know what Miss Grant was talking about, never having heard that there was a letter. But Crystal knew that the scrap of paper in Miss Grant's hand was a piece of the letter that had been written to Victoria Gildersleeve. She knew no more than that, however. Her mind was not quick to accuse her friend. It accused herself instead. She was mortified, almost beyond words. Oh, how horridly stupid of me, and careless, she exclaimed. She wanted to run away. She wanted to hide her head. I forgot all about that letter. I haven't given it a thought since. You mean you didn't give it to Hilda to address? No, I didn't give it to her. I simply forgot it. Where did you lose it? Here. When Hebe was cutting my hair, I dropped it on the floor. Then she picked it up. I remember that. Then I forgot it. An awful yes, a truly awful silence, followed Crystal's hurried sentences. Then she picked it up. It came too long after to be an echo, and it was Miss Grant's voice. The tone made Crystal shiver. Crystal, go bring that woman back here to me. No, bring her to the sewing room. Paul mustn't be disturbed with all this. Miss Grant swept Crystal and Hilda before her to the door. Paul called after Crystal, "If you do see Hebe, Barker, tell her please to come and finish the book, or I'll go on without her." He, at any rate, seemed utterly unconcerned, but when they were gone, he lay with an uneasy grin on his pale face. Out in the hall, Crystal stood her ground. "I can't go chasing her," she explained to Miss Grant. "She went away because she wanted to. I don't want to bother her." Hilda had melted away while Crystal spoke, much in the manner Hebe had melted. So Miss Grant and Crystal were alone. "You really mean you won't go after her, Crystal?" she said in a voice cold with displeasure. I don't know what's come over you this summer. You aren't behaving like yourself at all, and I am sure all your friends are concerned. Do you realize that that woman read my letter to Victoria Gildersleeve and tore it up? There were things about herself in it. She may have suspected that. In any case, she read it and destroyed it. She will have to come and explain. I'm sorry. Of course she didn't read it, and she didn't tear it up. Miss Grant, you don't know Hebe. And you mustn't call her that woman. She didn't do it. She didn't do it. Pshaw! Of course she did it. Just that. Opened the letter and read it. Who else? Get her, Crystal. She's probably in her room. Where is that? In the garden house, Crystal answered. But I can't go. They were at the door of the sewing room now. Miss Grant called to Agnes, who was standing, having a hem pinned up on Juliet's burial robe. Come here, Agnes, she commanded. When Agnes came, she gave her the errand. Go to Hebe's room, she said, and bring her here to me. Tell her it is something very urgent, and that I shall be gravely displeased if she doesn't come at once. Agnes looked her surprise, but she picked up her long, shimmering white skirts and went. You stay here with me, Miss Grant directed Crystal. I want you to repeat what you said when Hebe gets here about her having picked up the letter, about your having noticed her do so. Agnes returned after a few minutes, alone. Well, Miss Grant demanded, won't she come? I never asked her, Agnes confessed. You know, Bianca has put such a feeling into that hall out in the wing. I went all the way to her door, and I couldn't knock. It was awful. I didn't dare. Miss Grant looked at her daughter, completely surprised and taken aback. But there was something in Agnes's face that gave her pause. The vivacious Agnes was oddly subdued, stilled by something Miss Grant could not fathom, but without thinking about it very much, she gave it her respect. I shall have to go myself, she said, and she went. The long, dim hall, which was the approach to Hebe's dominion, held no awe for Miss Grant. She went lightly along it, with purpose in every muscle. It's queer they put her off here, over the sheds, she thought as she opened the narrow door onto the narrow bridge. They've made everything else pleasant enough for her. I wonder why they didn't give her one of the regular bedrooms. There are plenty in this big house. She knocked on Hebe's door. There came no answer. She knocked again. Then she opened the door and looked in, fully expecting to discover Hebe sitting still and cowering foolishly, hoping against hope that Miss Grant would go away. But her eyes, searching the room, did not meet Hebe's guilty eyes. So she was not here at all. Miss Grant stepped over the threshold. It was an odd room, one of the oddest she had ever found herself in. But exactly why it impressed her as being so odd she could not have told. It was mostly its feeling. There was such a stillness over it. It might be a room in the sky. It was so still. The walls were whitewashed, and the uneven, warped floor was painted dark gray. It's strange Bianca didn't attend, at least, to her having a rug, Miss Grant mused. The bed was narrow and looked hard in its snug white spread. There was one straight-backed chair, painted gray like the floor, and a gray bench in the open window. It might be a monk's cell, more than that woman's room, Miss Grant declared, mentally. Then she saw the mirror, clear, almost supernaturally clear, in its ebony frame. Her heart beat a little faster. Her face, at that instant, bore a strong resemblance to the face her daughter Agnes had shown her a few minutes ago. But in spite of her beating heart, she crossed the slanting, ill-matched boards of the floor to the little door opening onto the circular staircase and the room of the flower pots. She opened that door and stood looking down into darkness. If she had looked longer, looked until her eyes became accustomed to the absence of light, she might have seen a presence of light, faint, elusive light, at the other side of the room below her. The light would have been the glimmer of Hebe's white dress, for Hebe was sitting down there in the farthest shadow on a big overturned flower pot, waiting for Miss Grant to go away. But Miss Grant closed the door before her eyes had penetrated to Hebe. She closed the door softly, and she left the room softly, with one backward, thoughtful glance at that little mirror of supreme transparency, and she went out, down the long, dim hall, more like an absent-minded, futile wanderer than the purposeful woman who had come up it. Chapter 20. Love and Reason. The rest of that day was almost too full for thought. The dress rehearsal was scheduled for 1 o'clock, and was to be complete in every way, except for the lights. The light rehearsal would come that night, the actors merely walking through their lines again, and not stopping for stage business. A photographer was coming from Boston to get some pictures, and so, of course, every last detail of the costumes must be completed. Bianca was giving the actors a picnic supper at the Red House, so that they need not take off their makeup or have the bother of going home only to return again so soon for the evening's work. It was decided to leave Romeo's costume as it was, because time was so short and there were so many last-minute things, even more important, that must be attended to. Crystal industriously coached Esther in the nurse's part, in a corner of the living room, whenever they were not actually out on the stage rehearsing under Miss Grant's eye. Everyone was excited and elated, everyone except Crystal. She was strangely conscious of not being excited, but there was an iciness in her calm. She went through all the motions required of her. She coached Esther with patience and industry until the younger girl was letter perfect, and even aware of some of the humor of the part to the point of showing it in her acting. Then, as Romeo, out on the stage, in the general rehearsal, Crystal actually triumphed. She did not have to be prompted once. This surprised and delighted everyone, and Hilda, at the end of the first act, rushed away to Paul with the good news. It began to look as though the performance was to go very much as planned, in spite of Paul's accident. There was general rejoicing, and a shower all around of congratulatory exclamations. And Crystal was still very calm. She said to herself, "I am as quiet inside as though I were dead." She had no sense of hurry and no sense of fatigue. She was the most useful and the most used person present. She coached, she acted, she sewed, she ran errands, she advised, and she prompted. She was Miss Grant's right-hand man. Hilda was too immersed in actual carpentering to do the odd jobs that came up, and as for the others, they were not so quick to respond to the calls for help. Crystal was very quick and very ready, and her apparent calmness in effort made her appear capable of more burdens. Alexander, finishing the painting of the sets, was thoughtful. He alone seemed outside the general clatter and struggle. He watched Crystal whenever there was opportunity, his smoky blue eyes ambiguous. Miss Grant, standing by his side for a minute as the tomb scene drew to a close, exclaimed under her breath, "Isn't Crystal wonderful?" His response was merely a murmured, "Wonderfully tired, I'll say." Miss Grant looked at him. "We're all tired, of course, but isn't it worth it? I think this whole affair is just too wonderful for the young people, so worthwhile. Shakespeare will always mean something to them now. Why, it will have a lasting effect on the aesthetic side of their natures forever. It has done as much for Agnes as a whole year of school, I do believe. It's worth a little tiredness." "Yes, but not such extreme fatigue as Crystal is displaying." He was grave and concerned. Madame Coldwater had been right, Miss Grant thought now, in saying that Alexander had changed in the last month strangely. The irresponsible artist in him seemed to have given place to what? Something deeper, but indefinable. He met her speculative gaze. "Would you mind, Miss Grant," he asked, "if I took Crystal away for supper alone? We can filch a sandwich or two and dash off somewhere in my roadster where she can be quiet and get some peace before the evening business begins. Will you give your consent?" "But she is quiet," Miss Grant contradicted him. "No one is so quiet and poised as Crystal today. That is what is so wonderful. Usually she's utterly scatterbrained and forgetful and excitable. I should think you would pick anyone but Crystal for your concern. But may I take her when she's done with this? Will you spare her?" "Why, yes, I suppose so, if she herself cares to go." That was what Alexander himself doubted, whether she would care to go. But he sought out Bianca and asked her for the sandwiches. She was surprisingly interested in his project, Bianca, and put him up an appetizing and nourishing supper in spite of her own busyness. She did it herself, not delegating it to any of the maids. And she added a thermos bottle of hot cocoa. In her broken English, she said, "See that the little girl eats. She is pale. See that she eats." So, another besides Alexander was aware that something had gone wrong with Crystal, and it was the very last person in the world one might expect to notice, Bianca, the somber Italian woman. Crystal was surprised at Alexander's suggestion that they dash out to Gull's Landing for a supper alone together, just the two of them. But she consented readily enough, only they must get back before 7. Alexander promised that they would. When they were there, sitting on the sand, which was still warm from the afternoon sun, and Alexander unfolded the chicken and celery sandwiches from their oiled paper wrappings and poured the cocoa into 2 tin cups, and even opened Crystal's napkin for her as though she herself were helpless. To Crystal's own surprise, she could not eat. She put a sandwich to her lips and then back again quickly on her paper plate. "What is the matter?" Alexander asked. "Don't you like chicken?" "Here's a marmalade, then." Crystal looked at him vacantly. "Nothing's the matter," she said. "I just can't eat." Then, after a second, while he gazed at her inquiringly, she added with supreme conviction and in a hollow dead tone, "I shall never eat again, not so long as I live." He did not laugh. He had no desire to laugh. He spoke quietly. "Well, little kid, I knew you were up against it, up against something. Please tell me, and perhaps I can help." "Why, no," Crystal said, still in the hollow, dead tone. "There is something dreadful, but I haven't been thinking about it, and I'm not thinking about it now. I have put it out of my mind." Crystal really thought she had put it out of her mind. She thought that the calm that pervaded her, the calm that seemed like the peace of death, was evidence of that. She was not thinking about that torn letter that had been found in Paul's grate. She was not remembering the envelope in Hebe's hand after Hebe had picked it from the floor. She had put it all out of her mind, very far out of her mind. If you are not thinking about the dreadful something, then why can't you eat? Alexander asked, with reason. Crystal glanced at the sandwich on her plate. A wave of revulsion at the sight of it crossed her face. She turned her head away, looking out across the level blue water, which was stilling itself in preparedness for the sunset's glory. What a pity they had cut her hair! With her eyes turned away like this, she might be anybody with a bob. They all looked alike, just an ordinary flapper. He wanted her to turn back so that he might see her face and her eyes again, so that she would be Crystal. But the next instant he forgot his selfish irritation. He was aghast, almost frightened. She had covered her face with her hands, the face he had been wanting to see, and she was crying. It was a horrid kind of crying. It twisted his own face into a queer grimace to listen to it. It was hoarse and strangled and ugly. It was not the unashamed sobbing of a child, and not the controlled weeping of a woman. Alexander was accustomed to both. He had little girl cousins who cried, and his mother, lovely and dignified as she ordinarily was, used tears unscrupulously as an argument. This was entirely different. This crying of Crystal's. It was ghastly. It was uncouth. It was unbelievable. He did not move or speak. He had an impulse to run away, far away from the sound of that painful sobbing, but of course he did no such thing. Instead, after a minute, he forcibly took her hands from her face. "Stop, stop, I say," he commanded, her eyes there. He patted the back of her hair. "You poor little kid," he said, more softly, and he did not command her to stop again, but she did, almost at once, and sat up. He gave her his handkerchief, for she had none. "Now," he said, "you had better tell me what the matter is. What has happened?" His face was almost as worn as hers when their eyes met. "It's about Hebe," she said, "but I thought I didn't care. I even thought I wasn't thinking about it at all. I didn't know I was going to cry. I'm not a crying girl. I want you to like me, Alexander. I want you never to remember that I cried." He answered, "I shall always like you, Crystal, but I shall always remember that you cried. I can't help that. Now what about Hebe? What has the lady done?" "She hasn't done anything. It's Miss Grant that did it. Or if Hebe did do something, it can be explained. I am sure of that." "Then why cry? Tell me everything." She told him, and she ended. "The letter was torn up. I saw it myself, and yet Hebe had it in her hands. I remembered about that while Miss Grant stood there looking at it in the fireplace. But I don't believe she tore it up. She couldn't have, not Hebe." "No, I don't see how such a person as Hebe certainly is, the person you and I know Hebe to be, could do such a disgusting thing as open a letter written to someone else and then destroy it because it had something unpleasant about herself in it. I agree with you there. So why cry?" "I didn't know I was going to cry. I wouldn't have cried for worlds if I had known." Indeed, this was true. Crystal had never been more surprised in her life, nor more ashamed. She turned a shoulder now to the witness of her shame, and pressed her palms against her hot eyelids. A fisherman, rowing in from his weirs and beaching his boat not far from where they sat, must have thought them a strange pair of young people. Crystal had borrowed a dark cape from Hilda, and she sat swathed in it from shoulder to ankles, the gorgeousness of her costume quite concealed, but her bowed head and hidden eyes, and something tense in Alexander's position and expression as he leaned toward her, stirred the fisherman's curiosity, with purpose of overhearing whatever there might be to overhear. He passed them by, within touching distance almost, although his homeward way was in the opposite direction. But it was wasted effort for him, for the two were quite speechless as he passed, although he thought that they were actually unaware of him. "I didn't know I was going to cry. I wouldn't have cried for worlds." Alexander was thinking about Crystal's words, but he had not been so entirely unaware of the fisherman as the fisherman had imagined. When the man was well out of earshot, he touched Crystal's shoulder and bent nearer. "The fact that your own tears surprised you means," he said, "that you had put your doubt of Hebe away so far back in your mind that the light of your reason hadn't a chance to reach it. That's what I think. But now that it's out in the light again, it needn't bother you any more. The light dissolved the doubt, didn't it? It couldn't have lived at all, your doubt, except in the dark, pushed back there into your subconscious mind, like potato sprouts in a cellar. Hebe's straight goods. Hebe's fine. All you have to do is to think about her to know it. You would never have doubted it at all if you hadn't just jammed Miss Grant's suspicions when she mentioned 'em to you right down into the cellar of your mind and never stopped to examine 'em. But now, well, now, isn't everything all right?" "Yes, it is. Perfectly all right." Crystal was clear enough about that. But still she spoke from the shadow of her lifted hand. "But it isn't exactly the way you say. Not quite, Alexander. Just thinking about the doubt of Hebe, looking at it, wouldn't dissolve it. For, don't you see, it does look as though what Miss Grant thinks is true, that Hebe did open the letter, read it, and then tear it up. It really looks that way, even out in the light where you've pulled it. It's something else, now that it's up out of the cellar, that has done for the suspicion. It is the feeling I have for Hebe. I love her so much that I can't believe she did it. I am sure now." Alexander was silent. He was trying to decide whether he ought to tell Crystal what he knew about Hebe, the thing that would allow the light of reason to mingle with the light of love, and so assure himself that Crystal would not again suffer from doubt of her friend. He would certainly do so instantly if she should begin to cry again, but somehow her voice had sounded as though she was through with crying, and he was, after all, under a promise to Hebe not to tell her secret. They had struck a bargain. She had let him paint the portrait in return for his promise. He had been on the verge of unfaithfulness to his word, but really it was getting to be rather a tangled mess. "I guess love is wiser than reason," Crystal said, and she dropped her hands from her eyes to clasp them about her knees. Her eyes were clear again, now that he could see them, almost clearer for tears. "It knows a lot more than reason knows." "You bet it does," Alexander agreed with her most emphatically. "You bet it does. It sees all round it. Reason sort of shrinks, doesn't it, and shrivels when brought into contact with love. You have certainly said it." He had reached his left hand and placed it over Crystal's two clasped hands, with warm strength. Crystal looked down at it, a little surprised. They sat that way, hands clasped and shoulders touching, for some long minutes, while the smooth water of the sea flushed to pink and then slowly dissolved into lavender, violet, purple. But Crystal's words, when she spoke finally, had no reflection of the glamour of the sunset waters. She said, "It's funny, but I'm awfully hungry now. How many sandwiches are there, anyway? And do you suppose the cocoa is cold? It's too bad it's been open all this time." There were 8 sandwiches, and they each had 4. Crystal could have eaten 5 or 6, but she insisted on Alexander's having his fair share, and the cocoa, in spite of its not being hot, they found delicious. Before returning to the red house for the light rehearsal, they walked half a mile or more down the beach and back, watching the color fade. They talked. At least Crystal talked. The relief and comfort that had somehow come to her in Alexander's companionship made her unusually gay, as it had made her unusually hungry. Alexander, on the other hand, was extraordinarily silent, but Crystal did not notice that particularly, nor did she notice the ambiguous expression of his smoky blue eyes whenever their glances met. Toward the middle of that evening, Miss Grant found herself, in an interval between arranging the scenes for the flashlight pictures, beside Alexander for a minute. "Whatever did you do to that girl, Crystal?" she asked in a whisper. "You said you wanted her to get quieted. You mentioned peace, and she's never been so flighty and irresponsible and impossible in her life as she is now. She was the calmest person here this afternoon, before you took her away, and I was beginning to change my mind about her character. But now it's all over. She's almost ruined Romeo's cloak, getting against your paint, to say nothing of smudging the cell door. She lost the call book simply carrying it from the living room to the stage there. And I am sure she has spoiled at least 2 pictures by moving during the flash. Your rest hour was a distinct unsuccess, my dear boy." Alexander grinned, but she did not see it because they were standing in the dark beyond the radiant glow the water curtain was shedding. "Sorry," he said, "but I like her evening's calm better than her afternoons." "It's a different kind, that's all." "Indeed it is. It's Crystal's natural. Unnatural she was, too good to be true." "Natural she's too true to be good," he murmured. Then he laughed. It didn't mean a thing, of course, just nonsense, but he was so relieved about the subject of their conversation that nonsense was his way of celebrating.